Today we're looking at this classic thing, the original IBM PC 5150. We'll be taking a tour of it and see if it turns on. Will there be some fixing to do? Probably, right? This is retro tech after all. So let's get on with it. I recently came across an ad where someone was selling an IBM XT, not very far from where I'm at, in an unknown condition. No price was given, but the seller was open for bids, so I bid about 100 euros or US dollars. I've been on the lookout for an original IBM computer for some time, but they tend to sell too fast and too expensive anytime they turn up. The seller was getting other bids, but told me he'd get back to me after a few days, and he did. Apparently some other bidder hadn't shown up as agreed. I drove there late one evening and loaded it into the car and decided to leave it in the car until after work the next day. Meanwhile, in the evening I was reading up on the XT and watching some videos on the system. Then after work the next day I took the computer, monitor and keyboard in and opened it up to check the internals. I had bought an XT system, yet I noticed that it had two floppy drives. I had read that the XT came with one floppy drive and one hard drive as standard, but I figured that maybe the hard drive was a hard card inside the machine. But when I got inside, I counted 5 ISA slots, not the 8 that the XT is supposed to have. I quickly looked for the label, and yes, this was indeed the legendary IBM PC, the 5150, with a Model F keyboard and a 5151 monochrome monitor. Let's take a tour of this thing and see if it turns on. So here we have it then, the 5150 that I picked up, and yeah, let's take a little tour. It's a keyboard. Look at the keyboard more closely, but here's the computer and the screen as well. So this of course has the two 5¼ inch floppy drives, and they are actually IBM branded. You can see they're in the corner of the A drive and they're in the corner of the B drive, which is pretty neat. I'm not quite sure if you're supposed to have them like this or actually closed when you're not using them. Maybe closed, right? Like that. And here's that excellent logo, IBM personal computer. This finish, which is so legendary, right? Here's the badge for the display, and yeah, so first thing, here are the knobs. You can see the color is coming off this one a bit, and it is really hard to turn actually. It's really hard to turn, so yeah, that probably needs some help. Right, let's look around the back before we open up inside. Actually, let's look on top first. Yeah, here the cover was actually missing, the screw cover here, but on the other side it was actually attached, but you can see that the yellowing is very different. It's a different kind of plastic. It was kind of chipped as well. So I actually found online someone has made a 3D model of this. I'm going to print 2 new ones in a color that kind of matches this, or trying to find the paint so I can paint them afterwards. Right, let's have a look at the back. And yeah, here we have it. So the monitor is the 5151 monochrome monitor, of course, and I think the color one kind of sticks out a bit in the back, but this one is absolutely straight like this, and the cables come out underneath. They're permanently attached. 2 cables, and of course one goes into the power supply of the it's like a pass-through power supply, so it turns on, the monitor turns on with the computer, and the other one goes into the video card, which must be this one. We go from this side, we have the label there, the 5150, and above the power sockets, made in Greenock, Scotland, United Kingdom, and auxiliary power to the 5151. If you have a color display, then it has a separate power cable. It doesn't use the pass-through. Copyright 1981, of course, there.
Here we have the only two sockets on the actual motherboard, the Model F keyboard connection. Here it is, and connects like so. Nope, like so, with a groove on top. And then is the seldomly used port for cassettes. And this is the floppy drive card, which has an external port as well. I believe the external floppy drives were not made until much later, but it has one. This is the first modification. I don't know if it's modification, it's kind of a damage, but that this computer has. You see here, someone has, so there's basically these black metal parts that are part of the case that stand between the slot openings. But here, someone has actually sawed it off. And I don't know why someone would do that, probably to fit something really big in here. But yeah, if anyone knows why someone would have done this, do tell me, because in the current configuration this is not necessary. So I don't know, I'm going to have to try to find some way to sort of 3D print something to cover up that slot, or just get more. I mean, even if I get another card in here, there will still be an opening between because of this being removed. So I want to find some kind of neat solution to that, but otherwise it's in a good shape. Yes, and also the screws that hold the case together were actually not included, so I was carrying this with some difficulty. But so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws that are not that were not included, and 4 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4 hold the power supply in place. But yeah, let's. I'm going to take the monitor off and let's open it up.
First though, taking a closer look at the keyboard, one can see that it's really dirty. Someone has been using this a lot. I'm going to have to clean it properly, just look at that, especially where the palms rest. But the keys too. Super cool though to have got my hands on this legendary keyboard as well. I'll try it properly once it's been cleaned. And here it is then opened up, and as you can see it is much wider than it is deep, which is a bit unusual in subsequent models of the PC. But yeah, they have it, 2 full-size disk drives, the A drive and the B drive. Very chunky things, taking up, I don't know, well, almost half of the space in here, and of course the power supply. And it's connected down there. Here we have the motherboard underneath, and the cards. Let's take them up and have a closer look at these cards. Of course, some cards go all the way to the end, but both of these cards are smaller. And yeah, this is a very interesting card. So this is the monochrome card, and if I zoom in a bit here, you can see that it says 1985 Commodore monochrome PCB, made in West Germany. So yeah, this was actually made by Commodore, and I don't know if they made general purpose PC clone video cards, or if this was to go in one of the sort of Commodore PCs, but yeah, this one uses it, which is pretty cool. And if we put this to the side, take a look at the other card. Of course, here the disk drives are both connected to the end here, and then if we take it out, we saw from the back that it had a connector there on the back. And yeah, this is how it looks. This looks like a really old, is it? Or really new or really old? No, let's look at the date codes. It says 1984 in most of these actually. So yeah, I guess this is from 1984 then, this card. Doesn't say much else actually, it seems.
So look at the back. Yeah, you can see that it's an old card, the way the traces look. But yeah, that's that. And there's not much more to it actually. You have the dip switches there, and the 8088 processor right in there. Also 1984 date code. Here's the PC speaker mounted and connected there to the PCB. And yeah, the PCB goes from here to here, and it ends by the power supply, so it only goes underneath the first drive, about a bit more than halfway, and it's laying like that. We have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ISA slots. Of course, it was when I saw the 5 slots, it wasn't until then that I realized that this was actually a PC and not an XT, which, yeah, I don't know why I didn't realize that earlier. I guess I just took the seller for his word, right? And yeah, looking at the power supply, 1984 as well. So it has been reworked to G. Don't know what that means, but it's a European power supply here. 220 volts, 63 watt. Do not remove this cover.
Right, I'll put this back together. The monitor and the keyboard are connected now. Let's see if I'm lucky enough that this actually works. The red chunky power supply switch is as legendary as the computer itself. The fan is turning, which is a good sign. I didn't hear any static on the monitor, which is common with CRTs though. I think there's supposed to be some beeps and the drive seeking, and of course something on the screen. Maybe the contrast and brightness knobs need adjusting. It's a bit annoying that there's no power light on the PC, only secondary signs of life such as the monitor and the disk drives, none of which show any signs of life now. The PSU fan does spin though, which seems like a good sign. Something should have happened by now. This doesn't actually seem to be working properly. I wasn't sure about the video card or the 5151 monitor, and also the tantalum capacitors are famous for failing on the motherboard, so there are many potential failure points here. The Minus Zero Degrees website is an excellent resource for IBM machines, and I decided to do the minimum diagnostic configuration to try to narrow the problem down. It is done with only the power supply and the speaker connected to the motherboard. It's important, of course, to have the dip switches set correctly, as these function as the BIOS on the IBM PC. The connector on the motherboard has 2 parts, and it is crucial that the black ground cables meet in the middle as seen in the picture there. As we saw, there are 2 sets of dip switches on the motherboard, and the one closest to the center is the number 1, and the one closer to the edge is number 2. With this setup, I turned on the power supply and listened for the 1 long beep and 2 short beeps that are supposed to come after about 5 seconds. This did not happen. There was no sign of life except the turning of the PSU fan, as we heard before. With that result, we can keep on clicking our way through the troubleshooting. Here we can click on whether the PSU fan is turning or not, or just briefly. Also, it's good to make sure that the speaker is actually okay. This is also useful info. Just because the fan turns, it does not mean that the PSU is okay. If I had another power supply, I certainly would have tried it. So the PSU and the motherboard is still under suspicion. Now it's time to measure the voltages from the PSU to the motherboard, and here is the pinout. We see that there's a bunch of +5 rails, a -5, 4 ground rails in the middle, and then +12 and -12 along with power good. I did these measurements with the multimeter while the PSU was connected to the motherboard, and none of the values were correct. There were only a few milliamps showing. The reason the PSU has to be connected to the motherboard is that the PSU won't function without a load. So with that, I moved on in the troubleshooting. To rule out shorts on the motherboard, I had to test each power rail for shorts, which isn't a too uncommon thing apparently when a capacitor blows. This is of course done without the PSU connected and measuring the resistance between ground and each power rail. -0 degrees has the expected values for each rail, but in short, no pun intended, there should be at least a few hundred ohms resistance for all rails. If the resistance is 0 or just a few ohms, then the rail has shorted to ground, and the culprit on that rail has to be found. I did the measurements, and there was no shorting to ground on any of the rails on my motherboard, so the motherboard does seem okay. For me, the troubleshooting ends here. As it says there, the logical deduction is that the fault is with the power supply. This was the state of my tiny computer space during testing. The 5150 in pieces there. Since the PSU is the likely culprit, I decided to measure the voltages. However, as I mentioned, even a functional PSU apparently won't turn on without a load. There seems to be different ideas as to what load is actually required. I saw a video where it took not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 hard drives for one to work, and so I decided to dig out 4 hard drives and try. Surely the motherboard alone pulls less than 4 hard drives, but there it is. There's also the potential issue of too much load and the PSU shutting down since it's only rated for 63 watts. Annoyingly, the power supply only has the 2 Molex connectors for the 2 floppy drives, so I had to get a splitter cable for this test. The power supply fan is turning as before, but the hard drives that I dug out from various computers are not turning on. No sign of life in any of them. Here is the voltage measurements from the PSU with a load. There is a sudden surge to 3 volts on the 5 volt rail when I turn it on, but then it drops down to 1.5 volts and then 2 milliamps within seconds. Let's look at that again. We see the capacitors emptying there after the PSU is turned off. Same thing again. Doesn't it seem like the real drop happens just as the fan picks up speed? This time without the load and up close on the multimeter. There is clearly 5 volt there, and it doesn't fall as quickly as with the load, but still. So the PSU does not seem to be working, and maybe there are other issues as well. With a faulty power supply then, what are my options? Well, the simplest fix would be a drop-in replacement with another PC or XT power supply. I've looked at prices though, and they're very few for sale, and they cost way too much. Most of them are in the US anyway, and are US PSUs. I also considered buying a PC clone, but I have to wait around for one to show up, and I'm not sure whether it would fit in the 5150 case. PC compatibles may not include the PSU dimensions. One potential solution is getting a ATX to AT adapter dongle. I ordered one from AliExpress for next to nothing here. ATX power supplies are easy to come by, and maybe one can even cram one into the 5150 case. I'm not too fond of PSU cramming though, and another issue is that the ATX does not provide a -12 volt rail. The most obvious fix would be actually fixing the faulty original power supply, but since it is potentially lethal to poke around in power supplies, IBM never released the schematics. On the VCF forum I found that Mr. Mrmanse had made schematics for the same kind of PSU I'm using. I'm no good at this though, but I'm sure it will come in handy. Link in the description to that schematic. I guess the reason there are so many guides to every other fault except power supply faults is that the PSU is dangerous and difficult to troubleshoot. I'm just going to check so that the capacitors look okay and take a look at the diodes. The usual warning, these power supplies are potentially lethal even when turned off, so don't open one except if you are sure of what you're doing. After inspecting the components, I couldn't see anything that looked out of the ordinary, so nothing obvious to fix like a burned out reefer cap. There are a bunch of diodes on the PCB, and I read somewhere that they may fail, so I decided to try to test them. There's a diode testing function in most multimeters, which tests the voltage drop across the diode. If the diode is working, the drop should only be in one direction. The diodes can only reliably be measured outside the circuit, but I decided to see if I could get any indications while still on the PCB. Two diodes had values that were the same in both directions, so I decided to desolder one leg and measure it properly. This one actually measured fine when one leg was lifted out. Not the other one, though, it was faulty. Or maybe I ruined it with the heat when I desoldered it, who knows. Here it is, and as you see, it measures the same both ways, which is not supposed to happen. I ordered a bunch for like €3 from AliExpress and soldered it back in place. Because of the beefy solder planes on the bottom of the PSU PCB, one has to heat the iron up quite a bit to melt anything. I usually solder at 360 degrees Celsius, but here I had to go around 450 to manage to melt anything. With the new diode inside, I was pretty excited to see if it would work. Could I have fixed the PSU? I hooked it up to a 3 hard drive load. I actually found some drives that power up but that don't work, so hopefully they can be useful here. Better than taking out my functional drives from my computers. Nope, nothing with the 3 hard drives. Disappointing. I decided to try with a 4th hard drive, but no luck with that either. While pondering my next move with my power supply woes, I decided to take the keyboard apart and clean it thoroughly. I was also curious about the buckling spring mechanism and the internals of this thing. It has a nice solid steel plate underneath that explains the very surprising weight of the Model F keyboard. Nice with these signatures there from the manufacturing and quality control, I guess. This too was probably made in Scotland then, the UK, and it's from 1984, just as the computer seemed to be. This is the rubbery membrane that the metal pads under the buckling springs press against and make contact. It was kind of sticky in some places, so I wiped it off with isopropanol alcohol. Here's the metal part that the keycap shafts come up from. It really needed cleaning, and taking it all apart allowed me to make it look like new again. There are all the pads with a spring that buckles and presses down on the pad. I was worried I would lose one of these, but the springs are firmly attached to the metal pads at least. We can also see the underside of the spacebar there. It is the only key that cannot be removed from the keyboard without taking it apart like this. This is because of the metal stabilizer there that we are used to seeing under spacebars, but usually not inside the keyboard like this. If one tries to remove the spacebar without first opening it and removing the stabilizer, then the thin ends there of the spacebar will break off. I had forgotten the orientation of the connector when I took it apart, but I managed to find the pinout and the ground connection on the PCB. help me find the right direction here. Here are all the metal pads with the springs back into their shafts, and the back end with the membrane and metal plate is going on top. The length of the spacebar of the Model F is insane. Here it is along with the Apple keyboard M0116. Almost twice the length. The keyboard cable doesn't appear to be the original black one that is coiled, but this one is grey. But yeah, this one does the job. And here for some retro ASMR with a clean keyboard. Enjoy. So this thing turned up locally, and I'm very happy about that. It's an AT power supply actually, and I didn't think of that, but of course these also work on the PC and the XT. They have the same connector here that combine and go into the motherboard, and it has a bunch of Molex connections as well, and the pass-through. Yeah, I got it at a really good price, and of course has all the voltages here, and it's actually instead of the 63 watt, this one then is rated at 200 watts, so this is more powerful. The downside of course is that it doesn't actually fit inside the case. It does have the chunky switch, which doesn't sound as chunky, and is not red, and it won't fit inside the case. The AT size is much bigger than the PC and XT size, but this should work with the PC, and so let's try to power it up and see if it works. So I'm checking the voltages here, but it's not looking good. It starts off at 5 volts, but then it drops and falls. Not very fast, but still. I really hope this one also needs a load to function and that is not faulty. Here is the setup then with a 3 hard drive load. Crossing my fingers. Yes, this is the sound we like to hear. SCSI drives doing their thing, and steady voltage reading. Looks like we're in business. That is excellent indeed. Let's see the other voltage rails as well. And yes, there is the 12 volts alive as well. 11.52 should be plenty. Okay, so let's go through the pins on the motherboard connector and make sure all is fine there too. Three plus 5 in a row. All good. Minus 5 there also. That's good enough. Minus 12 is good. Plus 12 is fine. The last plus 5 and the power good are good as well. Awesome. Now let's connect this to the 5150 and hope that the old PSU was the only fault. So, moment of truth. I have the AT power supply plugged in there from the outside the case, since it doesn't fit inside, unfortunately. Here we go. The power supply is quite silent actually, and there is no other sound yet. Blinking? I see a blinking cursor. Ah yes, the monitor is working, and there is sign of life. Yay! Beep and seeking disk drive. It seems to be working. Awesome. There we have it on that lovely green monochrome screen. The IBM Personal Computer Basic version C 1.10 1981. 62,948 bytes free. Cool, so this motherboard must have 64K of RAM then. Wow, I can't believe it. This is a dream come true. See if we can input something with the keyboard. Random stuff, but it works. I put things together a bit more to try this disc that came with the computer. It's the only disc that came with it. It had a sticker that said System on it that fell off. Underneath was this sticker, Commodore PC Hands-on MS-DOS System Disc. This is the second time Commodore features in this machine. First the graphics card and now this. I can see there is a Commodore sticker there underneath the label also. I don't have any other 5¼ floppies for DOS except this with Planet X3. It won't work of course in monochrome, but maybe we could list the contents and test the B drive at least. Drive A. V-disk, yes, the A drive and system disk appear to be working. Will we get the iconic DOS prompt? The drive is chugging away at least. There's the cursor and activity. Yes, there it is, C drive, virtual hard drive, excellent. Let's see which DOS version this is with command.com. Okay, version 2.10. That is probably a good version with this configuration of limited RAM. Cool, let's see if the B drive works also. Really hope so. From what I gather, these drives are pretty reliable. Yes, the light comes on and there is the contents of the Planet X3 floppy listed. Excellent. Will it try to run the game, I wonder? Let's try. No, of course not. Nothing happening there. So this is how I managed to power on the machine with the lid on. I moved the cards to the right so that I could fit the power cable through the first slot to the connector on the motherboard. Luckily the cables were long enough. I also used my Molex splitter cable from the hard drive load earlier to reach the disk drives inside. So this is one chunky setup at the moment, but it works. So here it is then, up and running. My now rather precious IBM 5150. I managed to get Adrian Black's IBM logo to show there, which looks great. Link to his GitHub page in the description. I'm really pleased I could get hold of this, and I'm happy that it was only the power supply that was at fault. I'm going to keep working on the original power supply and hopefully have it working for another 5150 video in the future. I also want to 3D print those screw covers on top of the 5151 monitor and do something about the gaping slots there in the back. And games. I have to find cool era appropriate games to play on this thing. I hope to see you back for all that in a future video. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate if you hit that like button. And if you like more retro computing coming your way, do consider subscribing to the channel. Take care and thank you for watching.